Now that the rear spoiler has been removed, the next step was to remove the rear lights. Each rear light cluster can be accessed by removing the interior trim to expose the back. Each cluster is held on by 5 10mm nuts that are easily removed. As with the spoiler, if there's any visible rust, make sure that you use penetrating fluid and the rocking technique to carefully undo these nuts. The cluster will now pull out of the aperture and is usually reminiscent of that scene from Aliens where Ripley finds Newt and pulls her from the alien queen nest. The sealant has failed on the near side at the top of the aperture. This has let water into the boot, causing a damp, musty environment to cause all manner of problems, including rust. If you have a damp boot on your Subaru, this is usually the culprit, certainly on all classic GC8 Imprezas. The near side rear cluster has a wiring harness on a connection block. This is usually quite easy to disconnect, and you can remove the bulb holders and the wiring from the cluster by twisting them off. The connection block is held in place by self-tapping screws. The offside rear cluster has a similar setup and can be disassembled in the same way. I removed the sealant from the mounting ring that runs around the edge of the wiring harness and bulb holders. This will need to be resealed on assembly. The sealant on the offside aperture shows that the seal has held and therefore has prevented water leaking in. It's important to ensure the cluster is sealed all the way around to prevent rainwater penetrating the boot and making your car smell like a wet cat. Each cluster has a body trim panel, known as the hockey stick. These are body coloured, so if you're changing the paint code, you'll need to paint these. I disconnected them from the cluster by undoing the 4 self-tapping screws. To remove the old sealant from the rear of each cluster, I utilised the power of a very slim wood chisel. These are able to get between the plastic of the cluster and the sticky black sealant, forcing it away. It's horrible stuff and you'll get it everywhere, including on you. Thankfully, White Spirit is good for removing it from hands, clothes and worktops. So now the sealant has been successfully removed from the back of the clusters, we need to do the same to the body. This is achieved by using plastic scrapers to avoid scouring the bodywork, and White Spirit to soften and wipe away any residue. The rear clusters are now ready to go into storage. I'm bagging up and labelling all fixings and keeping them with any larger parts I remove from the car. It's very important that you store items carefully and be as methodical as you can. The apertures clean up very nicely and will provide a stable base for new sealant when the clusters are reinstalled. I'll be doing a lot of careful test fitting before applying sealant to both clusters and the aperture edges. The spare wheel is stored in the boot of this model of Impreza. It's covered over by a shaped piece of hardboard that includes the winding handle for the car jack. The hardboard has become damp and has deformed a bit. It's also covered in mould from the damp. Ugh. I may be able to straighten this out and clean it up a bit. The spare wheel is fixed in place by a central bolt that anchors it to the base of the wheel well. The fixing is twisted off anti-clockwise, but due to the dampness it may be quite rusty. The bolt is around 8mm, so it's reasonably strong. You can slip a small flat-bladed screwdriver into the handle of that bolt to gain a little bit more leverage when you're twisting it off. The spare tyre is in remarkably good condition considering its 18-year vintage, and the fact it's been stored in an automotive paddling pool for a good 5 years or so. And judging by the tread and the general condition of the tyre, I suspect it's never been used, which hopefully means the car's been carefully owned and not had too many trips on 3 and a bit wheels. The spare wheel well had a nice amount of water stored in it. This was removed by the use of old towels to soak up the water and dry the well. There's going to be a small amount of rust treatment work required in the wheel well, but the situation looks better than I first feared.